So we went through demographics, went through cohort behavior. Now let's try to break that down a little bit and look at urban versus suburban to the extent we can. I start with census numbers, and census numbers indicate that a vast majority of the growth has been suburban. When you start looking at this, I go back to 1910 right up to 2000 in case you can't read this in the back, and you can see the red is the suburban growth, and it's been massive. Urban growth, not so much so. Well, what's the likelihood that'll continue in the future? Let's take a look at the next couple slides. Well, and I didn't give credit to Eugenie Birch. She's a researcher at Wharton. I'm pulling this information from one of her articles, and it got late, okay? And I forgot to put sources in all this. But when we start looking at the breakdown of the downtowns, and when we look at downtowns, to give you a sense of how she's defining downtown, it would be kind of the east of the river would be considered downtown in Milwaukee. The city would likely be considered the city of Milwaukee, and the suburbs would be the non-city, non-downtown areas. Look at the breakdown. We've got 71% of the people in downtowns being non-family. Where you go out to the suburbs, it's a far lower number. As people go from being family with children, will they feel comfortable and want to maintain their housing situation, their housing tenure, as they had in the past? That's a big question. Let's go to the next slide. From there you go, the racial composition. We end up having far less white downtown and far more minorities. And as we looked at this, we already recognized that what are the growth areas? It's not white folks, it's minorities. Next slide. I put this in. I think it's interesting. I don't know how it really adds to the discussion, to be honest with you, other than it does look like the creative class is likely to be downtown rather than in the suburbs. Somehow was rather interesting to me. Let's go to the next slide and spend a few minutes on this one. It goes a little bit to Andrew's comments earlier. When we start looking at the behavior of where people chose to reside, and we tick back 30 or 40 years to the 60s to the 80s, what drove our decisions? It was avoidance that drove our decisions. We wanted to avoid the crime of downtown areas. We wanted to avoid the pollution of downtown areas. We wanted to avoid the social unrest. Remember the riots? Those were real. They wanted to avoid poor school districts, and they wanted to avoid density. So what did they choose? They chose large lot, large house suburban locations. In short, what they were valuing was on the site. How is that likely to change in the future? What are the preferences of today's young adults and maybe empty nesters? Well, when we start looking at this, well, many of these problems here, not so much so anymore. Anywhere from New York City and beyond, the crime isn't that bad. The pollution isn't that bad. Social unrest, not really. So what are we looking for? We're looking for walkable neighborhoods, so I can walk to the drugstore, to the grocery store, to the coffee shop. Proximity to retail, proximity to work, and we're kind of indifferent to schools because guess what? Our kids aren't in school. There's only 23% of the households actually have kids that are living at home. And they want the amenities of an urban life, a live, work, play environment. And so what's happening with the housing choice? Some great work by Art Nelson on this. Small lot, multifamily living, and an amenity-rich location. So we're buying not what's on the site, not the square footage of the house, but the proximity to the set of amenities that are important to that person. Is it the bar? Is it the church? Is it, what is it? Is it the coffee shop, okay? So let's go on. So that goes to a little bit of suburban versus urban. But going back to the earlier slide with Painter's quote about we lost 1.2 million households 2005 to 2008, and that trend likely continued since then. Let's look at the impacts of income. And this is an important slide to be looking at because it starts to show you what some of these different racial groups as well as the average household can afford as far as their housing tenure choice. And you can start to see all races, the thick blue line in the middle. First off, you should note that it's gone down. I think that sparked some of the anger in the most recent elections. People aren't richer. And these are inflation-adjusted numbers, though, folks, okay? So they're real numbers. But just the same, they're not any richer. And since this data, and this is the most recent data that's out there, is 2008 on the household level, it's only gotten worse. Okay? And then from there you go, what we have is the Hispanic and black populations as a group are making about 2/3 of the overall population. Where are they likely to be? Probably in multifamily rental housing, just based on their income levels. Let's go on. One of the things that's interesting when we start looking at income levels, I thought this was worth putting up here. When we look at Wisconsin a little bit, I could have bored down to Milwaukee. It is interesting to note that we are one of the top 18 states in the country that have more than a $46,000 median household income. Matter of fact, if you look at 2008 data, we are slightly above national averages. By 2009, we were slightly below. Effectively, we have an average median household income, but I'd suggest with that a pretty good quality of life. Let's go on. But not a pretty good quality of life for everybody. I trust some of you saw this. It's been touted by many. Poverty rises in southeast Wisconsin. Milwaukee has the 4th highest level of people below the poverty rate out of hundreds of cities. Looks bad. While that's real, there's a concentration of low-income households in the country, in the county, and in the city in particular. It makes us look like, wow, how can we attract any employers here? Well, let's go beyond this data and look at the following. I said, let's take a look at this because the city size is a artificially defined area, and comparing the city of Milwaukee, which might be in a very narrow area, versus other cities which might include more suburban type areas, isn't quite fair. A fair comparison is the economic unit, which would be the MSA. At the MSA level, you can start to see here, and that includes these 4 counties, we end up having a poverty level of about 12%, or 12.1%, fully 1% lower than the national numbers. I think we need to present both sides of that. I don't think we should ignore the challenge that we have in the city of Milwaukee. But there is a real concentration of those concerns that happen to fall in the city of Milwaukee. There's a greater responsibility for that. Let's go on. So what did we learn from the household income levels? Median household income has stagnated. 1. 2, minority household income is about 2/3 of the overall. Single person households have about 70 to 90% of U.S. median income. These income numbers are important because it starts to go to the choice of housing tenure, owner versus renter. Median household income in Wisconsin is approximately national averages. Milwaukee has concentrated poverty levels. And some of these income numbers will reveal weakness in consumer sales, but probably strong apartment demand. So I'm trying to make just ties to the different property types over the next decade. Let's go on. I have a handful of other things that I think are relevant to some of these decisions, and I've grouped them into employment and other considerations. This is a tough one. Actually, Wisconsin's done better than the national average. We'll talk about why in the sectors that are generating some of that better reporting than the national average over the last year and a half. These are national numbers. I took us back all the way to 1990 for a couple of reasons. But first off, you'll note that from the heights in 2008 of about 138 million people employed in the United States, it dropped to about 130 million. You'll also note that number, that 130 million number, takes us almost back to, or it does take us back to 2000. We've had no job growth over the last decade and more. The reason why I included 93 to 2000 is during this period, folks, we had a monthly increase, average increase in employment of 241,000 jobs. About 140 of those, 140,000, are necessary to sustain the incoming the workers, right? Because we're having a growing job market. So to even maintain a level unemployment rate, we have to have job growth of 125 to 150,000. Let's call it 140 for convenience sake. If we had job growth during this whole period of 240 less 140, that means we had net job growth of about 100,000. 8 million people, possibly more are out of work right now. 8 million divided by 100,000 means 80 months to get back, presuming that kind of growth. If you take the sweet spot in the middle of this, we had growth for the best 12 months of 340,000 jobs a month. Subtract 140, it would still take 40 months. Why do I go through this? What we're going to see is we're going to have slack labor out there, supply, for the better part of the period between 2010 and 2020. Let's go on. Let's take a look at Milwaukee. I've highlighted 2 areas. This is kind of the establishment data, as it's called. I've highlighted these 2 areas because we have 150% of the manufacturing jobs of the United States as a whole. So if there's one manufacturing job in the United States, there's going to be 1.5 here. So we are heavily concentrated in manufacturing. You know that. You also might know that we are heavily concentrated in educational services. So for every one nationwide, we actually have 1.2 here for education and health services. I think that's kind of interesting. Why do I think that's interesting? Let's go to the next couple slides. First off, there's a McGill University study. McGill's a great school up in Montreal. And they found that Milwaukee is the 5th in a list of U.S. cities for concentration of education. We export education here in Milwaukee to other places. That's a growth market. Next. From there, Forbes found us to be a good place to be from a manufacturing perspective, among other things, because we have energy and environmental jobs here. Think JCI, Johnson Controls. One of our speakers is from Johnson Controls, and the growth from that. Also, when you start looking at manufacturing, I think that will be a growth area more so than many think. Let's go on. Home ownership rates dropping. Why do I think manufacturing is going to be a good thing to have here in Milwaukee and to have an over-concentration of it? What we have here is a Wall Street Journal article from the 8th, so a couple days ago. And this is what we spend. We spend about 70% of what we make here in the United States. Compare it to the UK, to Germany and China, they don't spend so much. What we are going to need to do, and what Geithner and what Obama are doing out in Seoul, Korea right now, is saying we've got a wicked bad imbalance from a trade perspective. At one point, it's our bad. We spend too much. At another point, we've got to realign things a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. What we have done is done a little bit of realignment, and these are stunning numbers. It looks pretty boring, but our consumers actually have paid off, or has been written off. I can't tell you the breakdown of those two. 200,000. So we're realigning. Next. But here's what's unsustainable. It's our trade deficit. And so what we're going to need to do is that's going to need to change. How will we change it? It's going to be through having more manufacturing jobs here in the United States over the next decade. Next. In summary, manufacturing, education, and health services will serve us well over the next decade. Future needed reductions in consumer spending may be offset by the reduction in the debt that we've taken in this area. Retail markets will be slogging along. Office property markets will continue to struggle. I don't have much to say there. Multifamily, it's a perfect storm. We've got growing demand for minorities, growing demand from young adult and empty nesters, and falling home ownership rates.